Are you in the market for a chainsaw, but also in the market for something that can cut branches 15 feet above your head? Well, I got a pole chainsaw that might be right up your alley. It is called the GEVEELIFE 2-in-1 electric pole saw and mini chainsaw. It's a 6-inch chainsaw that is going to be good for cutting a lot of things and helping you out with some yard work outside. So let's go and dive into this thing and see what's up with it. And by the way, I did receive this from the company as a gift, so I don't have to return or anything. Anyways, let's go ahead and get into it. So like I said, this is a 2-in-1 design that has a great advantage to it. You pretty much have the mini chainsaw, this is the first design, and then you have the pole saw. So it makes it easy to be able to cut things from, from waist heights, branches that are on the ground, or logs that you need to cut into smaller pieces. And then at the same time, you can also cut up branches that are up in the trees that you can't reach, and you don't want to really climb onto a ladder to reach them, or they're just out of reach on a ladder. You can easily tackle both. And honestly, it's held up pretty nicely during my testing on this. Now, in talking about this extension pole, it does reach up to about 15 feet. And the extensions themselves are spring loaded. So as you extend out further and further, they do spring back on you. I'm not too sure why. It's probably more like a safety thing. But for me, I found that it's a little tricky to get the second pole all the way out to that 15 feet. However, I imagine, like I said, it's probably more designed that way on purpose. But do watch out on that, as when you unclip it, it will spring back at you a little bit. The second pole will spring back. The first pole, once one pole is down, the other one won't spring back too much, so you don't have to worry about that too much. And if you are a little off balance when holding the pole, you do have a little strap that you can put on with 2 little plastic pieces on each end, so it'll give you a little extra stability in case you do need that. And one of the coolest things about this is that this is actually a brushless motor that has 2 4-amp batteries. So a lot of the times when you get a battery powered product, you don't get the batteries with it, or you get one. This one provides 2, and being both 4-amp, they have plenty of charge to them, so you have plenty of time to be able to do a long task. I'm not too sure, how many hours it would last. It lasted for all of my testing and all of my tasks, just one battery. And then it takes a little while for them to charge, but it does come with a charger, so that could take about all night to charge per battery, especially if it's low battery when you first receive it. But I love the fact that it does have those 2 batteries, and because of the brushless motor part, it does give it a little better efficiency, while the motor is slightly quieter and requires a little less maintenance than traditional motors would. So while taking the thing apart, you could see that it was super easy to take apart, to clean up, and to put back together. Couldn't put it back together again. You just gotta get used to it. The more you use it, the easier it will get. But that was super easy to use. Now you will want to put oil in this, so chainsaw oil specifically. And so I might poured a little too much when I did mine. But you do want to pour a little bit in there so it keeps the blades all oiled up, so nothing sticks, as that's kind of something you want to make sure you can avoid. And say you have some weird angles when you are cutting branches, you do have an 180-degree adjustable angle to this. So that is going to be off the extension pole, but you do have angles that you can use and to be able to get the right angle for yourself, because it has a little protector on the top part of the blades, probably so it doesn't fling back up at you. But then the bottom side, that means you will have to kind of adjust based on how you're trimming things. You might have to angle it a different way than you would have preferred. So this will give you the flexibility to do so, as it's a 180-degree little turnaround with it. And as you might notice in some of my demonstrations, I did use the little tension rod a lot to adjust. It's because it's a tool-free device, so you don't want to keep the chain super tight. If it's super tight, it won't spin or it'll lock up on you, and you don't want that. So you want a little bit loose, but as you're using it, it kind of can get a little looser. So don't go through like a bunch of branches without looking at every branch or so. But you can use it for a branch, you'll be fine. And that's what I would recommend too. Just keep monitoring it and you should be okay. But I really found this thing to be pretty beginner friendly. I have used chainsaws before, but not a ton. I don't actually own one, so this is going to be my first chainsaw that I actually have myself, and I'm really happy I got one. You don't need a big chainsaw either. 6-inch chainsaw works for a lot of jobs. Now, you're not going to be cutting gigantic branches, just huge thick branches. But if you want to do some little trimming around the house, around your trees and bushes, and not going for like the trunk of a tree, you should be okay, and you should be able to do most tasks with the blade itself. Now, if you do want something else, you would have to adjust otherwise. Also, I can't forget to mention that this does come with 2 blade replacements, which is awesome. Always makes it a little easier to get tasks done and to not have to worry about replacing something right away. Anyways, that's really all. I liked it actually a lot. It worked really smoothly. Everything cut nicely, and I had no issues whatsoever while using it. I plan on keeping it around and using it for any other tree cutting tasks that I might have in the future. So I hope this information helped you out in picking out a good chainsaw for yourself. This is a 2-in-1 chainsaw and a pole saw. So yeah, until next time, I'm Andrew Frech. Have a great day. Bye. And by the way, if you do like my content, feel free to give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. It always helps out. Otherwise, have a great day.